Hi again. I want to give an update on the books I've read from the library a week ago. So now it's a week later, it's Sunday again, and it's October 1st. Yeah, I love October. So in that bag, I want to talk about the books that I read, and most of them were short books, which, it's funny, I don't participate in the wonderful month events that go on in BookTube all that much, but I think the one that I have really enjoyed, Women in Translation, and then Shorty September, is just at the very least getting into my head in September, like, you've got a lot of short books that you own. Maybe you want to think about looking at them on the shelf and seeing if you're in the mood to read one of them. So that was fun because I did do that, and they were completely fantastic experiences. And then I think I made a video on that about short books in September. And then just knowing that I wanted to get to some books and they happen to be short, so why not get them from the library now? And so it's been really fun doing that. So here we go. The first one, I've been meaning, this is like a BookTube book I've seen a couple times, and it's Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville. I do want to get back into Herman Melville through, obviously, Moby Dick, but since I'd seen this, I thought, why not? It's been described a couple times as like this guy, Bartleby, is like the modern day quiet quitting. Like, what could that mean? So, in this 60-page book that Melville wrote really late in his career, it might have been his last real book, but it didn't do well, is what I've seen when I've looked it up. It didn't do well. It is about a legal office and guys that worked there that were writing things out. I forget now what exactly the job of a scrivener is, but I'm just going to say they're like copy editors or law clerks in a way, but really just copying things down all day. And there's a guy that comes into this firm called Bartleby, and he's a strange one. And I guess the interesting thing about the book, and probably the thing that frustrated people back when it was published, is that there's just never any conclusion or even background about why he's the way he is. He's a quirky character. So this is published by a company called The Art of the Novella, or actually it's not the company, because the company is Hybrid Book, and this was a project they did called The Art of the Novella, and this is one of them. I prefer not to, he respectfully and slowly said. That's really the theme of this book. This is Bartleby's proclamation over and over again, and we just never know why. But when he's asked to do things that you do in this job, help somebody else out, the boss needs you to actually specifically work on this, he says, I prefer not to. And then eventually he stops working altogether. And when he's asked to work, he says, I prefer not to. And then he's asked to leave the building, and he says, I prefer not to. I'm really interested to hear from other people that have read this and what their interpretation is, because I didn't like really get any interpretation, and that could have clearly just been me. So, but I was glad to get to this. This is like, it actually says YA, high school summer reading. And then I have a note in this other book to remind me how to pronounce the title, because I knew I was saying it wrong when I pulled it out of the bag, and it's recitative, I think, is the emphasis. But this is an interesting one. From what I read, this is a Toni Morrison book that she wrote later in her career, and it's about 60 pages long, or 40 pages long. It's a true novella. The story is about two women who met when they were girls, when they were like 8 years old, and they were put into a children's shelter because they were taken away from their mothers for different reasons. and they went to a school while they were at this shelter. And one is named Twyla, and the other is named Roberta. They met when they were 8. They spent 4 months together as roommates in St. Bonaventure shelter. The conceit of this story is that we know that these two girls are different races. And in fact, one is black and one is white, but we are never told which one is which. And so Morrison wanted us thinking about not really solving the mystery about who's black and who's white, but it's a larger study into why do we care? Why are we spending so much time trying to find this out? What do we take from the little clues that we think are clues? What assumptions do we make based on those clues? You can go down a never-ending rabbit hole if you look this book up. And there's Reddit post, and it was fascinating to see how much research and criticism is out there for you to see on this book. One of the most interesting things that I read about this book is the introduction, because it itself is 40 pages long. It's by Zadie Smith, and it's excellent. It's so worth these two things being put together to read this version of the book for her introduction and just laying the foundation of this story and how it fits into Toni Morrison's oeuvre. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Of course, I found myself trying to figure it out because I guess that's just what my mind did. But then I read it a second time without trying to figure it out. What makes it interesting when you do that and your mind isn't trying to figure it out is to see how brilliant this book is written, how brilliantly she writes this book to make it possible for you to think that you know someone, that Twyla is white or that Roberta is the white one or vice versa. Like, it's brilliantly written in a way that probably only Toni Morrison can do. So I highly recommend this one. And then this was my first Rachel Ingalls, called In the Act. This was written in the 80s, I think, or 70s, 1987. As long as Helen was attending her adult education classes twice a week, everything worked out fine. Edgar could have a completely quiet house for his work or his thinking or whatever it was. This is, I feel like, such a well-written short story. I feel like this is a short story that could have appeared in the New Yorker, and it has a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion. So I like that about it, that it was a fully complete story. Kind of like it's the lightest sci-fi. Not really, but a touch, just a touch. It's about Helen and Edgar, and she's home more than she was for reasons I can't remember. And Edgar is a scientist and he has a lab upstairs, like in the attic area, and he keeps it locked, and she's never allowed in there. And her curiosity gets to her because he doesn't even want her around when he's upstairs working in the lab. I think he works at work a few days a week, and then he's upstairs doing research in the lab that he's built out for himself. And he doesn't even want her home while he's upstairs working, and that seems really bizarre. So her curiosity gets the best of her, and she goes upstairs and finds a way in, I guess finds another key or something, and she discovers something that is really entertaining, and the story just takes off from there. And it's about how power dynamics can change in a couple, especially during the time this was written in 1987, when roles were more defined, as Edgar is clearly the main contributor to the household, finance-wise, and that the power dynamic shifts pretty interestingly in this book. And also what Helen thinks she wants, maybe it's out of spite, maybe because she's found what she found in the attic maybe isn't what she wants, but she's not really able to let go of that because she had that idea. I just thought the hijinks that ensue, I don't want to give up anything about this book because I didn't know anything about it. And I loved just getting into it and not knowing. And I think, madcap black comedy. I think, thankfully, I didn't read the back, but the back doesn't reveal the fun in this book. So read it for the fun, and really well written. Then I did read my first Mona Awad, which is Rouge. What do I think about Rouge? I didn't know anything about this book. I had heard it's like a horror having to do with beauty, maybe a cult. That's really the extent of what I've heard. I did listen to an interview of Mona Awad by Jalen from the Bar in the Bookcase, but I didn't listen to it far enough to, or even close enough to hear the details of this story. I was just interested in listening to Mona talk about her writing. So this book, I don't want to reveal the story at all, but I'll just say my experience of this book is what I would expect, and that is that I'm not a horror reader. I'm not a sci-fi bizarre. It's not magic realism, but just like things are going on that couldn't really be going on. But isn't that what horror is sometimes? It's monsters and a little bit of sci-fi. I did really enjoy the setup of this story when everything is normal. The protagonist's mother has died. They're kind of estranged. I think her name is Noelle. Her mother is Noelle, sorry, and her name is Belle. And her mother dies. She's been living in San Diego, or at least California, and she goes to her apartment and she starts to get a weird vibe from certain people that she runs into. And at the funeral home, she hears that her mother is in a lot of debt and she doesn't understand that. She had a store and she learns that her mother sold the store to this woman. I think it's Sylvia. And then she goes about she feels pulled to trying to understand her mother's mysterious death. And this is where the story starts to take the weird turn. I will say that sometimes I enjoy stories or even movies where somebody has discovered something that during the daytime it doesn't really exist, and they go to where that thing was, house, whatever you want to call it, and it's not there, or like the people in it are normal now. If that gives you a flavor for what this book is like, I think that this will be a fantastic book for most of you that love horror, or there isn't gross violence or anything in this book. So it is just a feminine horror. I don't know. It's about beauty and the extent that will go to not age. Then on a whim, I finally started again A Little Life. I had gotten about 33 pages in and then I never finished it last fall. So I don't know what happened. I just pulled it off the shelf, thought, I looked to see where I stopped, and strangely enough, it was where this first tab is, and I opened it up to the tab, and I actually underlined some stuff with a pencil. I never do either of those things. I thought that was so bizarre. First, I will say about this book, almost probably everyone watching this knows that this book is dealing with serious and hard to read matters having to do with one of the 4 college students whose name is Jude. So read all the trigger warnings for this book if you feel like you want to, that it's important for you to know how tough parts of this book is because of Jude and his background, his growing up, and the horrific childhood that he had, and even maybe adulthood. I don't know that yet because I haven't read the whole book. So I'll talk about just two sections that I underlined about the beautiful writing, because I'll talk fully about the book later, but I'm about 360 pages in, and I came to Hanya Yanigahara. Like, I bought this book when it first came out in hardcover, and I never opened it. I don't even know why I bought it and why in hardcover. And then I eventually donated it because I never, I think I started reading it and then I didn't keep going. And then I picked this up again when I picked up To Paradise in softcover after I read it, because I was going to see Hanya Yanigahara in person earlier this year, like in February, at a like writers lecture series here in Pittsburgh. And it was amazing. She talked a little bit about A Little Life. She talked mainly about To Paradise, but really she talked about her writing experience, and it was fascinating. And it really, I'd already read To Paradise, and I absolutely loved the reading experience of that book. And so it really made me feel drawn to reading A Little Life again. And then I will read her first book. So I'm reading her 3 books in reverse order. But the page that I underlined, so JB is on the subway. This is very early in the book. We're just getting introduced to the 4 college roommates that have grown up and are still friends in New York City. And this is what the story circles around. The other aspect of those weekday evening trips he loved was the light itself, how it filled the train like something living as the cars rattled across the bridge, how it washed the weariness from his seatmates' faces and revealed them as they were when they first came to the country, when they were young and America seemed conquerable. He'd watch that kind light suffuse the car like syrup, watch it smudge furrows from foreheads, slick gray hairs into gold, gentle the aggressive shine from cheap fabrics into something lustrous and fine. And then the sun would drift, the car rattling uncarryingly away from it, and the world would return to its normal sad shapes and colors. The people to their normal sad state, a shift as cruel and abrupt as if it had been made by a sorcerer's wand. God, the writing, God. Hanya Yanigahara, I gotta say. And then another passage that I thought illustrates the level of her writing, just how much craft goes into the way she writes. So in this chapter called The Postman, this is a chapter that starts to tell us a little more about Jude's background. And I won't speak here about why we are compelled to know more. Maybe I'll talk about that when I'm fully talking about this book. But this paragraph to me illustrates, like, how does she tell us so much in one paragraph? This is about Jude. Before New York, there had been law school, and before that, college. And before that, there was Philadelphia and the long, slow trip across the country. And before that, there was Montana and the boys' home. And before Montana was the Southwest and the motel rooms and the lonely stretches of road and the hours spent in the car. And before that was South Dakota and the monastery. And before that, a father and mother, presumably, or more realistically, simply a man and a woman, and then probably just a woman, and then him. So more on this later. I'm almost halfway through. I'm checking back in on my reading experience of A Little Life. I had to take a step away from this book for a little bit. I found that by the time I got up to where I left off from that last clip, a lot happens, even in the next 100 pages, from like page 350 to 470. We get more and more detailed information from Jude's past. And it's really hard. It physically is hard for a person to read this kind of abuse. And because she's chosen to drip and trickle it in different places throughout Jude's interactions with people in his life, I think that is brilliantly done, the way that she's decided to frame his past and weave it into how it's coming up for him. And it's solving mysteries for us based on things that's happening in his life. And because we're seeing the aftermath of what we know was extremely violent abuse. So I had to take breaks and not read this book, certainly at night, at bedtime. But I think that's a pretty common experience. I do feel like this is a really substantial literary work, because not everyone can write a book like this and it not feel to me like it was egregious, like where I've encountered cruelty with different books, it feels like it doesn't need to be in there, or it didn't need to be as graphic. And I never felt that way about this book. I just felt like I was going to be able to read it or not. And I did do a little bit of like, whew, okay, I gotta just, just lightly be reading that section. So there were times where it was almost too hard. So beyond the 2 passages that I read earlier, I have some other ones marked. I have many marked, but I'm just going to read this one. So he has, I'm not going to go into the framework of this book because you can read about it anywhere, but again, the framework is 4 friends from college who are now all living in New York City. Malcolm is an architect, JB is an artist, sometimes unwittingly using his friends as subjects. He's like a photographic artist. Willem is the actor and the person who is closest to Jude. So Willem and Jude are just getting closer and closer. Willem is the person who does a lot of checking in on and caring about Jude. They become very, very close through the years. And and Willem says here on page 494, so Willem is the actor, and yet he sometimes wondered if he could ever love anyone as much as he loved Jude. It was the fact of him, of course, but also the utter comfort of life with him, of having someone who had known him for so long and could be relied upon to always take him as exactly who he was on that particular day. His work, his very life, was one of disguises and charades as an actor. But his friendship with Jude made him feel that there was something real and immutable about who he was, that despite his life of guises, there was something elemental about him, something that Jude saw even when he couldn't, as if Jude's very witness of him made him real. So one of the things that is hard to concentrate on at the moment, but that you can reflect on later, is how Jude has enhanced the lives of people around him. And one of those people is Harold, the person who was his professor and then later adopts him as an adult. And I do think this book is largely about about what happens to this particular person with his very traumatic, violent background. The fact that Jude becomes an attorney and he's a mathematician is interesting, and he does make a comment about it here, how he feels at his law firm. There, he wasn't someone who cowered in the bathroom, but instead a series of numbers. One number to signify how much money he brought in, and another for the number of hours he billed, a third representing how many people he oversaw, a fourth for how much he rewarded them. It was something he had never been able to explain to his friends, who marveled at and pitied him for how much he worked. He could never tell them that it was at that office, surrounded by work and people he knew they found almost stultifyingly dull, that he felt at his most human, his most dignified and invulnerable. I do think this book is showing, through Hanya Yanigahara's creation, the life of someone who can look like they've survived something and they have their life together, and how this experience lives with him every day. And by reading the book, you understand just how and how awful that is. But I don't want to spoil it in any way, so I won't go into those details. But she said in an interview that, I wrote it down here because it was interesting. I watched an interview that she gave around when this was published, after I read the book, not before. I wanted to create a character that never got better. And then the redemption narrative never gets fulfilled. I also think this book is saying something about when you sign up to be a friend of someone that you learn or that you suspect has this background, that you may also not get redemption when you're trying to help them, when you adopt them as an adult, when you are there for them when you think that you need to be, that you may also not get redemption, that they may keep doing things that will never be resolved. And we get to see how very challenging that is. And if you sign up to love someone, or you just can't help yourself, that has a background like this, that you cannot know whether anything you do in life for them will save them. It's so complicated. It's so complex. I don't know. Other than this is definitely the most horrific book I've ever read. The only other horrific book I've read is any true life story about an Auschwitz survivor. So those are the only other kinds of books that I've read where I've stuck with it and I've read it. And I've almost not, of course, been able to read it, but I have. And I think for me, and maybe because I saw Hanya Yanigahara in person, maybe because I saw her speak, that, and also I watched the interview after A Little Life was published, that I know she wasn't trying to be outrageous and shocking for nothing. She wrote the book she wanted to write. I feel like it is, there are some absolutely beautiful passages. I think it's about why and how humans have the desire to keep on living in horrific situations, and it says a lot about us. And it says a lot about how people in our lives can also help at certain times and in certain ways. Yeah. So, whew. Thanks for joining me on this one. I really appreciate it. I know that there are so many views and opinions about this book, and I'm very late on this train, but I'm glad I read it, and I'm happy to move on to her first book now. And I'm glad to have been in the world of these people in this book. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.